Welcome to the Afterlife Files, where we investigate near-death experiences, shared death experiences, and how they affect you. Unlike podcasts that are just stories, we will give you the heads up on what to look for in our conversation, and then after the interview, help you make sense of those accounts so you can incorporate the insights into your life. I think you'll find that once having your most profound questions answered, you'll find more peace and joy living here in the physical world. We are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Bruce Greyson with us today. For those of you who haven't heard him, you are in for a treat. Bruce was there at the very beginning of the research into near-death experiences. He's both a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. His role for the last 40-plus years has been to investigate every theory that's come down the path with those two lenses. These theories were cockamamie to credible, and he loved the ability to investigate the validity of each idea. Here's a couple of examples. Are NDEs caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain, or the result of mental illness, or were caused by drugs? He did studies on all of them and so much more. By the way, the answer is no to each of those I just mentioned. For those of you who know of Dr. Greyson or have heard him speak before, you're also in for a treat. He's going to summarize the 8 lessons learned from over 40 years of research. He'll do that right up front. I think the last 2 might surprise you. Bruce will also talk about where near-death experience research is going beyond the physical and psychological approaches. For those of you who are sensitive to energy, pay attention to how he transmits his energy to you to emphasize a point he's making. About halfway through, he's talking about the near-death experience being hyper-real experience. He'll say, and I quote, "Much more real than me talking to you right now." And at that last bit there, see if you can feel that energy transmission. It's kind of fun. His conversation with the Dalai Lama about the role of empirical observation is priceless, as is the last 2 minutes of the interview. He sums up what he believes to be the NDE's contribution to society and how we should be moving forward. Have fun. Here's our interview. This is a wonderful day that we get to have Bruce Greyson with us. Welcome, Bruce. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, Scott. I'm so glad to be with you today.
Let me read a short bio. Okay. Bruce Greyson, MD, is the Chester Carlton Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences and Director Emeritus of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, and a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He thankfully co-founded the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and for 26 years, edited the Journal of Near-Death Studies. He has published extensively, let me repeat that, extensively on near-death experiences. Yay, Bruce, glad to have you here.
Thanks, Scott. I'm glad to be here with you.
Before we get going, I just have to do kind of this little intro because I was profoundly moved by this Bruce book. In particular, I thought it was just beautifully written. I wanted to stay with the stories and see where they were going. And you just led me through decades worth of scientific research in a way that I thought was not only insightful, but profoundly entertaining. I got about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I just got all teary-eyed because I'm sitting here thinking the amount of research and time and effort it took that went into this book is extraordinary. We are so lucky that we had you for over 40 years diving into what is near-death experiences and what are they comprised of and how do they make meaning. I'm just really heartfelt grateful. And one last thing, I'm really grateful that you didn't edit the life out of the stories. You know, some accounts you read them and they're just like, there's just nothing there. And some of us who are sensitive, you know, when we read what's on the page, you know, there's life there. There's the energy of the interview is still in the text. It's in the words. I don't wonder if it's not imbued in the ink on the page somehow. So really, thank you for writing After. And well, let's start with the obvious question. Why did you call this book After?
Yeah, let me just say thank you for those very kind words. I got to say, it was very difficult for me to write this book. For the past half century, I've been trained to write scientific articles in medical journals where you take yourself out of the story and just present the facts. And this is my first attempt to write something for people, not doctors. So I knew I had to put myself into it. Nobody wanted to read it. Why did I call it After? You know, it's funny because some people say, oh, it's a great title, and some say, oh, that's terrible. It doesn't mean anything. But the most obvious meaning is this talks about what happens after death. But I also had in mind what happens to people after a near-death experience when they come back. And as I got farther and farther into the book, I started thinking, well, it really applies also to after you read the book. What do you do with this?
There we go.
So it kind of had multiple meanings for me.
So I really appreciate that this has those kind of three perspectives. So one of the things that you talk about are kind of the 6 lessons learned from near-death experiences. Would you take a second and just kind of walk us through what those are?
Well, it's been a while since I wrote that book, and I've got more than 6 now.
Okay, you can add. It's all right.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I think people need to take away is that these are very common experiences. You know, most studies show that about 5% of the general population has had a near-death experience. That's 1 in every 20 people. So someone in your family, in your workplace, in your classroom has probably had a near-death experience. The second thing is that these are normal experiences that happen to normal people in unusual experiences. They have nothing to do with mental illness. We've done a variety of studies, which are described in the book, looking at the intersection between mental illness and near-death experiences, and there just isn't any. People of all types have near-death experiences. It doesn't mean anything about your psychological state. The third thing I think that's important to realize is that these experiences have very profound and long-lasting after effects, both positive and negative, and they need to be addressed. They can't just be ignored. They won't go away. The fourth thing is that these experiences, if you take them seriously, challenge our thoughts about mind and brain. You know, we're taught that the mind is what the brain does, that the brain creates all our thoughts and perceptions. And in near-death experiences, you often have the brain going offline or being severely compromised. And yet people say their mind, their concentration, their consciousness is more vivid than ever. And this should not happen if the mind is being created by the brain. The next thing is that if that's true, if the mind can function when the brain is not, that opens up the possibility that the mind can continue to function after the brain is dead. And there is a lot of evidence from near-death experiences suggesting that some part of us does survive bodily death. A very important lesson from near-death experiences is that death is not something to be afraid of. That whatever people have in a near-death experience, they come back saying, I'm no longer afraid of death and dying. And that's a tremendous thing for our society, which is so focused on death, particularly in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, where we're faced with death almost every day. I think for me, one of the biggest lessons is what people from a near-death experience come back from a near-death experience saying about this life, not about the next life. And they say they come back realizing that we're all in this together. We're not separate entities. We're like fingers on a hand. They look like they're separate entities, but if you look at the whole hand, they're all interconnected at the palm. And that's the way we are. We are all part of the same thing. And if you believe that, if you live by that, then the golden rule becomes not just a guideline we're supposed to follow, but a law of nature, that when you hurt other people, you're hurting yourself. And when you're helping other people, you're helping yourself as well. And living your life that way makes it a much more meaningful and fulfilling way to live your life. I think that was more than 6.
I was trying to add that up. I think we're like 7 or 8 there. We're good. In the process of accumulating this wisdom, I got the sense from the book that in the early days of near-death research, that your life was like, well, near-death experiences could be this, it could be that, it could be this other thing. And it just like they kept firing things at you. And it was kind of like your job to separate wheat from chaff. What was that like to have people keep pummeling you like that?
Well, I welcomed it because I didn't know how to make sense of them. You know, I was raised in a scientific, materialistic household, and we never thought about anything spiritual or religious. That wasn't part of our family. So I went through college and medical school with that mindset that the physical world was all there was. And when you die, that's the end. And then when I became a psychiatrist, I started being confronted with these experiences that we now call NDEs. There wasn't a name for them. This was long before Moody wrote his book that gave us the name near-death experience. I didn't know what to make of them, but I couldn't pretend they didn't happen because they were happening, and I was seeing them one after another. So being a scientist, I tried to study them and figure out what's going on. And I assumed at first there must be some simple physiological explanation for this.
Yeah.
So we kept testing one hypothesis after another and finding that data do not support any of them. And eventually, when I got to know enough of the near-death experiences in depth, the profound impact I learned of these experiences was far beyond any trick of the brain, any dream, any hallucination. It was something very profound going on here.
And so now here in 2022, is the science around near-death experiences reasonably settled? Near-death experiences are real?
Not by any means. I think most of those people who have studied near-death experiences in depth come away with that sense that these are definitely spiritual experiences. They're also physiological experiences. They're both. Right. I think when people argue about is it spiritual or is it physical, that's a bogus distinction. It's both. Just like my desk is wooden and it's rectangular, that's a physical description. It's also a legacy from my grandfather who left it to me in his will. That's a psychological or spiritual description. And you can't understand my desk without understanding both of those. And also with near-death experiences, you can't understand them without coming to terms with both the physical and the spiritual aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think most people who study near-death experiences come away with that understanding. But in the last decades, there have been more and more people getting interested in NDEs from a variety of perspectives.
Right.
And some of those are psychological, some are anthropological or sociological, and some are physiological. And they all come to the NDE with a different mindset. So some of them think that it's just a purely physical thing, and some do not. And it'll be interesting to see how they work this out.
Boy, that sounded like you were passing the flag right there.
Well, I am.
I've interested in seeing how they'll work it out.
Well, I think it's going to take more than my lifetime to work it out. And one of my jobs now, I think, is to mentor the younger people who are 20, 30, 40 years younger than I am, who are looking at this phenomenon and teaching them how to study this in a legitimate way and come up with their own conclusions.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because you've got the background both as a medical doctor and as a psychiatrist. So
You know,
you got two lenses to look at this. And certainly in the early years, you wrote a lot about the physiological things, and now I'm seeing just a general shift into how people are making meaning out of this experience, both individually and as a culture. Would you speak to that a little bit?
yeah, I think, as you said, I came to this as a doctor and a psychiatrist. So I came with first a physical and then a psychological mindset to it. But there are other people addressing it now with very different backgrounds, people with backgrounds in anthropology or in religious studies, who come at it looking at how is this the same or different from shamanic experiences, meditative experiences, other spiritual experiences, psychedelic experiences. And they have a different background than I do, and they can ask different questions than I can.
And I know in the book that several of the folks were wrestling with how did they make meaning out of this experience. Tell us a story.
Well, I think almost every near-death experiencer comes back with that. Whether they have a spiritual or religious background or not, the NDE often conflicts with what they thought was going to happen when they went into the near-death state. And they have to wrestle them with what does this mean? If this is a real experience, and I should say that almost every near-death experiencer thinks it is real, how do I reconcile that with what I thought was going to happen, what my belief system was? And although some go back to their original religion, the majority do not. They come away thinking that what they've learned in the NDE is a basic spiritual truth that transcends any of our organized religions. And they tend to feel equally at home in any religion, of any denomination. But they often have to struggle with how to integrate that into their lives. Now, for some people who are spiritual people before the NDE, that may not be difficult. But a lot of people are not, particularly in our Western culture, which is a very achievement-oriented culture. And I think it's hardest for people who live a life that necessarily involves violence or aggression. For example, I've talked to career police officers or military officers who, when they came back from a near-death experience, had a terrible time dealing with how do I live my life now, knowing what I know from the NDE. Let me give you an example of this. Steve Price was a self-described schoolyard bully whose goal in life was to become a Marine, and he did that. And he was actually a sergeant leading his troops in Vietnam, and he was shot. He had a bulletproof vest on, but he was raising his rifle to shoot, and a shell went in the armhole of his vest and plunged into his chest, and there was shrapnel throughout his lungs. He was air evac to the Philippines to a hospital, and in the operation to clear out the shrapnel in his lungs, he had a near-death experience, a very elaborate one, where he was encountering deceased loved ones and some type of a deity. And he came back full of this typical NDE ethic that we're all part of the same thing. There's no difference between me and anybody else. And knowing that, he didn't see how he could possibly shoot somebody else. And yet that was his job. That was his career. And after physical rehab, he was actually sent back into the jungle and tried to lead his troops, but just couldn't do it. And he ended up leaving the Marines and coming back to the States and training to be a healthcare professional. And you see that again and again and again, people coming back from an NDE and changing their careers, going into some type of helping profession, clergy, teaching, social work, healthcare, which often causes great problems in their families. If the family was based on material goods or a certain type of lifestyle, they may have to change the way they live their lives and the way the family is structured.
So, what about people who were raised to believe one thing about the afterlife and then came back and went, that's just bogus?
Yeah.
That isn't what I have discovered.
Yeah, that's very, very common. And I hear that from people who were raised in a particular religion where they were expecting a certain thing to happen and it didn't. And I've also heard it from people who were atheists who were expecting nothing to happen and were confronted by what they experienced as a deity. And they were totally flummoxed by that. But they can't deny their experience. One of the surprising things about this experience for me was that virtually every near-death experiencer says that this is a hyper-real experience. It's much more real than me talking to you right now. And there's nothing in my life that I can compare to that. So I just have to, take them at their word and say, yeah, okay, I take your word for it. I don't know what that means, but I gather that that means to you that's the ultimate reality. Yeah. And when you compare that with what their belief system was beforehand, they realized that was just a hypothesis that wasn't right, and I need to find a new one.
And for the most part, are they okay with that cognitive dissonance?
No.
No?
It's challenging because often their lives were built around this previous mindset or way of life, and it creates a lot of havoc in their lives. And they eventually come around to understanding, making sense out of it all, but it can be a very difficult adjustment.
Would you say that near-death experiencers come back with a more Buddhist perspective?
They do. They don't always say that, but the things they say are very much in keeping with the way Buddhists approach the world. They also tend to have what the Buddhists would call a fresh eye or a mind's eye, or a child's eye, and they approach each experience as if it's the first time they've ever done it. We tend to get jaded a lot, and they do not. And that's something the NDErs come back with. Each time you bite into an apple, my God, this is the best apple I've ever had. And the Buddhists tend to approach life that way also, that you're right there in the moment, enjoying this, getting the most that you can at this particular moment, and not looking at past apples or future apples, just what's going on right now.
I noticed that when you talked about the life review, you talked about it happening from three perspectives, that you get to have your experiences yourself, and you get to have the experience as the other, and then from this omniscient point of view. So it can be even like three different perspectives all going on at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very profound aspect of the NDE, which often leads them to this other worldview that we're all in this together, because they go back in the life review and re-experience events in their lives, not only through their eyes, but through the eyes of other people as well. Let me give you a couple examples of this.
Okay, great.
One is back as Tom Sawyer again. He had his NDE when he was in his 30s, when a truck he was working under fell down and crushed his chest. And he remembered a whole lot of sequences in his life that had this so-called empathic part of it, where you experience it from other people's lives. But the one that was most graphic for me was when he was a teenager, driving his truck down the street, and a drunk man winded out in front of his truck, and he jammed on the brakes, furious because this guy almost dented his truck, for God's sake. So he rolled down the window and started yelling at the man. And the man, unfortunately being drunk, reached his hand in the window and slapped Tom across the face. That was too much for this hot-headed teenager. So he got out of the truck and started beating the man up terribly. And he left him a bloody mess on the median strip, got back in his truck, and drove off. Well, when he had his NDE, he experienced this through his own eyes, feeling the rage and the adrenaline rush, but also through the eyes of the drunk man, feeling the humiliation of being beaten up by this kid, the 32 blows on his face. Now, Tom couldn't have told you it was 32 until he had his NDE, and then he counted them through the other guy's eyes.
He counted them? Oh my word!
He said, when you have these NDEs, you have time to slow down and see the whole thing in great detail. He said, you can count the number of mosquitoes that are around you in an NDE. but he felt this other guy's teeth going through his lower lip, his nose getting bloody, everything from this guy's perspective. And he came back from that realizing that we're all the same thing, that when you hurt someone else, you're hurting yourself, and we're all in this together. Let me give you another example.
Okay.
Barbara Harris Whitfield had an NDE in which she went back to her childhood in a life review and remembered and relived, I should say, being abused by her mother. And in her life before this, she had approached this in the sense of a victim, that I was abused by my mother, how horrible that was, how horrible my mother must have been. But going through this in her life review, she also relived it through her mother's eyes and felt how trapped her mother was in this way of relating to her kids and didn't know any other way to express herself. And she came back from this NDE with tremendous empathy for her mother and understanding of why this happened. And that changed her relationship with her mother after that.
Oh my. That's and you also talk about that, I guess it would be like the ripple effect about, what happened to Tom as he experienced this and what happened to the woman as she moved forward in her life. So how that individual action kind of played out into family and community.
Yeah. And as you said before, they experience it not only through their own eyes and sometimes through the eyes of other people, but also through a higher perspective, where they're looking down on the scene and perceiving it from a more spiritual perspective.
So back to the physical for just a second, because I was intrigued by you talking about the brain as a filter for the non-physical mind.
Yeah.
Talk about how you came to that conclusion and kind of what's your metaphor for this now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right. That's a metaphor. There isn't a literal filter there, but this has been a theory that's been current for at least 2,000 years. Hippocrates wrote about this in ancient Greece. He said the brain is a messenger or an interpreter of the mind. The idea being that the mind is somewhere out there and it communicates through the brain to the body, and the brain translates for the body. And this has been talked about throughout the centuries with different models based on the current technology of that century. People called it a prism, a reducing valve, and the current model is more of a transmission or a filter theory. The idea being that the mind out there has this incredible array of consciousness, and it's too much for us. It would overpower us to be able to perceive all these things. So the brain evolved to filter out all the, quote, irrelevant stuff and just let in a small fraction of our consciousness that'll help us survive in the physical world. Kind of like when you're tuning in a radio station with a radio. There are thousands of radio stations out there. And if you listen to them all at once, you wouldn't be able to understand any of them. But the radio tuner lets you tune in one particular station and filters out all the rest so you can make use of it. And the idea is the brain does the same thing. And this makes sense evolutionary wise, because the brain evolved, as the rest of us did, as a physical organ to help us survive in the physical world. You don't see the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It will overwhelm us. So your eyes not only take in the light, but filter out all the infrared, ultraviolet, and just lets in the small fraction of the wavelengths that we can use. And likewise, our ears don't let in all the possible frequencies, just the ones that we need. And the idea is that the brain does this also. It filters out the stuff you don't need to survive. You don't need to converse with deceased loved ones or with a deity in order to find food and shelter and a mate to survive in the physical world. So get rid of all that irrelevant stuff and just let in the important stuff. Does it taste good? Is it poisonous? Should I eat it or not? So the brain is kind of a filter that filters out all the spiritual realm for us and just lets in the information, the perceptions that are relevant to physical survival. This is not my idea. This has been current throughout the centuries. There's this book I want to recommend called beyond physicalism that's about reconciling spirituality and physical science. And it has two excellent chapters in there. One by Michael Grosso about the history of transmission theory or filter theory throughout the centuries, and the other by Ed Kelly and David Presti looking at current neurophysiological explanations for how this filter might work. Most people who have a near-death experience, when you ask them to tell you about it, they say, I can't. There aren't any words to describe it. It can't be put into language.
Yes.
And then we say, great, tell me about it. So we know we're forcing them to distort it by putting it into words for us. So they end up using metaphors, whatever comes to them, which are often their cultural or religious metaphors. So I think what's culturally determined is the way they describe it, not the experience itself. For example, people all over the world, and in fact, going back to ancient Greece and Egypt, will talk about a warm, loving being of light. And people in a Christian society may say this was God or this was Jesus, whereas people from other societies would not use those words. And even people here will tell me, I'm going to call this God so you know what I'm talking about, but it wasn't the God I was taught about in church. It's much bigger than that. And other aspects also of the NDE are described in metaphors. For example, many people describe going through a long, dark, enclosed space to get from this world, the physical world, to the spiritual realm. And we tend to call that a tunnel. But people in other worlds and other societies that don't have a lot of tunnels will use other terms, going into a cave or a well. I interviewed one person who was a truck driver who said, I got sucked into this long tailpipe. And that was his metaphor.
I love that.
So I think what's culturally influenced is the way we describe it, the words we use to describe it, not the experience itself.
And I think that's a really nice distinction. Thank you. The experience is the same, but how we tend to describe it is, we have to pull metaphors from our own experience. We have another choice. When people leave their physical bodies and they go into the non-physical world, they'll sometimes describe themselves like they're an energetic duplicate of their physical body. But do they see themselves in other ways too?
They do. And again, this is something that may be culturally determined. Some people talk about the silver cord going from your physical body to your spiritual body. Others don't talk about that. And some talk as if they have a body like the physical body that's not material over there. Others do not. Others just say, I was just a consciousness. I didn't have a body at all. Just my thoughts and nothing else. And some describe themselves as a little ball of light, like the ball of light, but a smaller version of it. So I think that's culturally determined how you describe what you experience at that point.
So we have, switching subjects again, since you were at the very beginning of all this, and we're now 40 some odd years later, you have seen individuals in our culture resist this information that you were bringing forth, and then have that evolve over time. What was that like at the beginning when it seemed like everybody said no?
Yeah, it was challenging because people, for one thing, didn't believe they were real. No one had talked about these NDEs before. So when I started talking about them, they're saying, oh, you're being fooled by a couple of patients. And then once they realized that these things are happening, they started dismissing them as just tricks of the brain. But I am very fortunate that I work with physicians and with nurses, and these are very practical people. They're more like engineers than scientists. They're concerned with what are the real effects of what they're doing. So if you can show a doctor or a nurse that it's important for them to know about this because these things really affect their patients, they want to know about it. whether they can understand it or not, they want to learn about it. So I've seen a vast change over the past half century in how people in my profession deal with these things. When we first started doing this, back in 1980, a few of us, Mike Sabom and Glenn Gabbard and I, talked at the American Medical Association about near-death experiences. And there was very polite silence in the audience, and nobody said a word. And now, when we talk to these conferences, it's rare that doctors in the audience don't stand up and say, let me tell you about my experience. They're widely accepted now and widely known. In fact, they're being taught in several medical schools now. It's just a fact of life. Like we should not talk about sexual abuse, or we didn't talk about alcohol abuse because those are considered taboo topics. And we realize now these are important things to talk about with your patients. And spirituality is becoming one of those things that used to be taboo, and now we realize is an important part of patients' lives.
And this cultural shift, how did it happen?
It happens gradually, very gradually. I mean, it's been 50 years and we're just still making headway with it. It's partly through educating people like doctors and nurses, but it's also the popular culture that's picked up on this. I mean, Homer Simpson's had an NDE. Now everybody's had them.
I didn't realize Homer was one of the brethren. Okay.
Yeah. So, when you see this time after time in movies and on television shows, it becomes less frightening to you and more acceptable to talk about these things. And once it's acceptable to talk about it, then you start hearing about it from your aunt or your uncle or your son, and you realize it's all around us.
I was thinking of Harry Potter. In the last film, he had a wonderful NDE. So, yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And one of the consequences of people leaving and coming out of an NDE is they lose their fear of death.
Yeah.
So what happens to them if you aren't afraid of dying?
Yeah, well, that is actually the most consistent thing we hear from NDErs, that they're not afraid of dying anymore. When I first started hearing about these 40 years ago, I was worried because as a psychiatrist, I deal with people who are suicidal all the time. And a lot of people are thinking about taking their lives, but are deterred because they're afraid what might happen to them if they did that. And if we tell them, there's nothing to be afraid of, death is not something to be afraid of, is that going to make them more suicidal? Mm-hmm. So being a scientist, I did a study of this, and I interviewed people who had suicide attempts and then either had or didn't have a near-death experience as a result of that attempt. And what I found, to my surprise, is that those who had an NDE were much less suicidal afterwards than those people who didn't have an NDE. And when I asked them about it, they said that, well, they had the same problems they had before they had the suicide attempt. Now they see those problems from a different perspective.
Oh, nice.
That my problems are not just this bag of skin. That's irrelevant, but I'm part of something much greater than that. And I can see that these problems are not something to be run away from, but something I have to grapple with and learn from and grow from. And they see a meaning and a purpose in everything that's happens to them, which makes their life much more meaningful and makes them less suicidal.
Isn't that good news?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, another side effect of this, by the way, Scott, is that if you're less afraid of dying, you also become less afraid of living. You're not afraid of taking risks. You're not afraid of losing your life. So you intend to enjoy life a lot more.
I'm all about bringing joy into our lives. That's a wonderful thing to end up our interview on. With just one, all right. So I was talking to a friend of mine and I said I was going to interview you. And she said, he's interviewed so many people. And there's one thing I've never heard him talk about. When we transition into the non-physical world, are we still married? Do we have spouses? Do you have any data on that?
I don't have data, but what people tell me is that these relationships, just like everything else about us, is an earthbound thing. the fact that you may be male, of a certain age, of a certain political affiliation, of a certain nationality, these are totally irrelevant to who you are. And when you transition to the other realm, you put aside all those things. And relationships are like that also. You don't have the same earthbound restrictions on your relationships that you do down here. So I think if you're talking about will I still love my spouse? Yeah, love is all over the place there. But it's not the type of conditional, jealous love that we have here on this earth. It's a more unconditional love.
That makes total sense to me. All right, I'm going to end on this quote I'd like you to respond to. It's from Fran Sherwood. Focusing not on the experience itself, but on acting on what she learned. So when people come back, yes, it's interesting what they went through, but that's not the point.
That's right, exactly. And many people have said this, like Fran did, that you come back wanting to talk about this and share with other people, but talking is beside the point. You really need to live it, to show people with your actions, with your life, what you learn, not just tell them about it. And what's important is that you change yourself and give other people a model for how they should change.
Lovely. Is there anything you would like to leave us with that I forgot to ask you that I should have?
I think as much as we know about NDEs, we still don't know very much at all. And especially those of us who haven't had an NDE are sort of stabbing in the dark. So I think we need to keep an open mind about all these things and be comfortable with not knowing all the answers. Because I think, as many NDErs say to us, we're not going to have the answers in our science and our language. It's beyond our language to understand these things.
Lovely. And lovely that you could join us and be with us today. What a great interview.
Thank you, Scott. Bruce. It's been fun.
It has been fun. So, thank you, Bruce.
Yep.
Off we go.
Okay.
Enjoy your afternoon. Enjoy your evening. And once again, thank you for writing After.
Thank you, Scott.
Love it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
My favorite parts of the interview were these. We're all in this together. This is a consequence of near-death experiencers learning that the very fabric of the universe is unity, not duality. Duality seems to be an overlay on the unity universe so that we can have the experience of illusionary separation from the divine. Remember the both and discussion? We can be both a separate consciousness and at the same time connected to the consciousness whole of the universe. An NDEer I interviewed put it like this: if I were to reach out and strike you, I would literally be striking myself. And why would I do that? With that awareness and the life review to give you a first-person experience of the consequences of your actions, this adds emphasis to the 8th lesson derived from Bruce's 40-plus years of research. If you remember, he said the golden rule is not just a social nicety, it's a rule of nature. What you give out is what you give back. What you give out is what you get back. We live in a reactive universe. Second insight. I really appreciated his story about the Dalai Lama and how both science and Buddhism are based on observation. It's one of the reasons I appreciate Bob Monroe so much. He was a pioneer in the study and application of out-of-body phenomena. Mr. Monroe would tell those of us studying and teaching at the Monroe Institute what he believed about the physical and non-physical universes based on his observations and those who studied with him to date. Here's the cool part: with the proviso that he reserved the right to change his mind based on new data. I most respect him for that philosophy. If adopted, that flexibility will make us all better members of the human race. Third insight. Look for more research into how we can make our minds go quiet so as to bypass the non-physical information filter installed when we came into the physical universe. Bypassing that filter allows the information from the non-physical universe to come in. Check out my website, neardeathmeditations.com, for more resources on this topic. Fourth insight. I was struck with how Dr. Greyson explained the original language of the NDE is probably all the same. But our brains had to filter it with the metaphors lodged in our memory in order for us to make sense of it. That would explain how so much of the NDE experience seemed to be culturally derived. Number 5. I love this. If you ask an NDEer what they were like before the experience and then ask them to describe to you what interests them now, you would say that their curiosity was ignited by the NDE. They won't tell you that exactly. You have to pay attention to how their interests and activities were changed or heightened. This is where good questions and perceptive listening makes a difference. I attribute ignited curiosity to the insights drawn from touching the light in the Unity universe. It was no mistake that both Anita Moorjani's warehouse metaphor and Bruce Greyson's car driving at night metaphor both involved a big light being turned on temporarily. The memory of what was in the dark never goes away. The curiosity of how to find it and what lies beyond our limited flashlight view has then been lit. Number 6. He ended the interview by saying that near-death experiences cause experiencers to be less afraid of dying and therefore less afraid of living. This has profound consequences for all of us because it means that the study of NDEs is not about the phenomena or about the dying. The impact is on our lives here in the physical. Find a way to be less afraid of dying so you can be less afraid of living. That will bring joy into your life today. Then, mentor that attitude to everyone you meet. Number 7, and last point. More than any one person, Dr. Bruce Greyson has been responsible for a major cultural shift in the Western culture. He and the people associated with the organization he helped form, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, have almost totally changed how we feel about death in the space of only 40 years. How do I know this? Think back to as little as 10 years ago. Whenever we talked about death, this image was almost always present. Let me show you. This guy, the Grim Reaper. It's gone now. It has been replaced with this image. The light at the end of the tunnel. Notice how different they feel. The Grim Reaper feels gruesome, alone, and at the mercy of some benevolent force. The light at the end of the tunnel has us move from darkness and denseness into the physical world, of the physical world, into the light of the non-physical world. We have agency. We are choosing to move into the love of God. It's hopeful, too. In the light, there are friends, family, and other loved ones waiting to embrace us upon our return. We are returned from whence we came, into a benevolent universe. On that note, it's a wrap. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and comment. You can find the Afterlife Files on all podcast streaming apps, Apple, Google, Spotify, the lot. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, or pay us a special visit at neardeathmeditations.com. Bye now.